Sherlock Holmes and the Highgate Cemetery, The New Adventures, Episode 5, based on characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, narrated by Karl Marx. On the 16th of March 1883, we were invited to attend a private meeting on 122 Regent's Park Road in Primrose Hill. It was about a potential investigation, the implications of which we could not have anticipated, that was quick to pique Holmes's interest. We found ourselves in the office of a German gentleman from an industrialist family from Barmen, Rhenish Prussia, who had recently expanded its operations to England. I did not recognize the elderly man with a long philosopher's beard who sat across from us as a representative of the textile industry, but quite the opposite, as a prominent critic of our economic system. I became acquainted with his early study on the condition of the working class in England during my studies. Although only parts of it were available in our language, those that were offered new ideas on socialized medicine. As we were greeting each other, I got the impression that Holmes did not know whom he was sitting opposite from. "You must know," I explained to Holmes. "Mr. Friedrich, or rather Friedrich Engels, is a well-known proponent of so-called scientific socialism and a theoretician of communism. His work carries great political significance far beyond the shores of England." Holmes did not show any reaction. He grumbled and acknowledged my introduction of Engels with a simple nod. "Let's not exaggerate." Engels began in professional English with a German accent. "It was my good friend Karl Marx who discovered the correlations between economics and society, the class struggle and revolution, and justified these using scientific methodologies. During his lifetime, I just played second fiddle, and I did so with utmost humility and gratitude. I had, of course, heard the news of Mr. Marx's passing 2 days earlier in his Maitland Park Road flat. Before Holmes had a chance to blurt out, "Who's that?" I quickly extended our sincere condolences for the death of your colleague and friend. Holmes's grey cells sprang into action upon hearing this. "Do you perhaps harbour the suspicion," he inquired, "that Mr. Marx may not have died from natural causes? Are we here to investigate a potential capital crime?" "A crime has indeed been committed," Engels replied. "However, it has nothing to do with the recent death of Mr. Marx. He's been ill for nearly all his time in exile here in London. Cigarettes, alcohol, and long, reckless work hours deep into the night exhausted his health. It is most regrettable and a heavy blow to the proletariat around the world that the work of Marx has ended prematurely, but it is no great surprise. So there is no reason to question the cause of death?" I interjected. Engels shook his head. "Not at all, Dr. Watson," he said. "His stomach, liver, skin, and lungs were damaged. Various stays at health resorts, from Carlsbad to Algiers, only brought him limited or temporary relief. In the end, Marx succumbed to bronchitis, as stated in his death certificate." "Well, if that's the case," I argued, "then I don't quite know what we can do for you. What sort of crime did you wish us to investigate?" Engels hesitated briefly, stroking his beard, before answering. "Theft. It's a case of theft. It has long been an open secret that Karl Marx had lived in precarious financial circumstances, which is why Engels repeatedly supported him with large sums of money. For this reason, it did not make immediate sense to me what kinds of valuable objects could have been stolen from his possession. So I dug deeper. To my knowledge, Mr. Engels, Mr. Marx did not have all too many possessions," I remarked. "Quite right," Engels replied and tapped his temple. "His wealth was concentrated in his mind. His thoughts, his insights are invaluable. His work is more valuable than the crown jewels, which, when it comes down to it, carry nothing but a price tag." Holmes was slowly losing his patience. Dear Mr. Engels, would you please be so good as to finally tell us what in God's name was stolen? I imagine it is not Mr. Marx's brain, which is now being peddled by a thief. Engels furrowed his aged brow. Please excuse me, Mr. Holmes, if I have kept you on tenterhooks. I cannot entirely refute your conjecture. Just as human labor is commodified in capitalism, so is the human body, and be it in the form of loot, Karl Marx's dead body has indeed been stolen. What followed was one of the few moments in which Holmes expressed bewilderment, his mouth ajar. I found his speechlessness amusing, then interrupted the silence. You mean to tell us, I asked, that the corpse has disappeared? That's right, confirmed Engels. It appears his body was stolen from the funeral parlor last night. Remarkable, muttered Holmes, who slowly regained his composure. Who does such a thing, and why? Now, gentlemen, Engels continued, I harbour the hope that you are the ones who can get to the bottom of this. Money is no issue. Feel free to set your own fee. That's the one problem. The other one is that the funeral has been scheduled for tomorrow at Highgate Cemetery. Guests have already arrived from the continent. It would be somewhat dishonourable to have to bury an empty coffin. It is my belief, therefore, that we must prioritise the return of Marx's mortal remains. Of course, I answered. When we find the body, however, we will certainly be at the heels of the culprit. Holmes nodded affirmingly, but he still wore a dreamy look, for the theft of a prominent corpse was a case after his own heart. Bizarre, mysterious, and presumably complex. Before you get to work, however, Engels said emphatically as he rose from his chair, I have another important request. Karl Marx's funeral and his legacy are of immense importance to the proletarian and socialist movements the world over. I would therefore ask you to be as discreet as possible in this matter. The press mustn't find out about this. Certainly, that goes without saying, Holmes confirmed. Engels raised his right forefinger warningly. But there is more. Even Marx's daughters, Laura and Eleanor, don't know about the theft of his body, and it shall remain so. The sisters have just lost their father after having lost their mother and eldest sister. The same goes for Marx's housekeeper, Miss Helena Demuth. I understand, Holmes replied. Since the body was not taken from the home, we won't need any witness testimonies, and we can rule out the three ladies anyhow. Ignoring his last comment, which was undoubtedly correct from an analytical standpoint, yet a trifle inappropriate, I focused on the first step of our investigation. We will first carefully inspect the funeral parlor. Would you agree? Engels nodded, picked up a calling card from his desk, and handed it to me. Seelenfried Funerals was written on it, along with an address close to Highgate Cemetery. On the coach ride to Camden, where the monumental cemetery sits on Highgate Hill, Holmes sat silently, head bowed, sorting his thoughts. When he finally looked up, I asked him impatiently, Well, Holmes, what do you think? This is certainly no regular abduction, he answered. Those usually aim to extort a ransom, which is why their victims must be kept very much alive. I don't believe that this is a case of extortion. If it were, Mr. Engels would have received a ransom letter. I waited a few seconds for Holmes to share additional and more practicable insights with me, but that did not occur. I spontaneously clapped my hands and called out, That's all? Holmes, if you're trying to make a fool of me— By no means, my good Watson, Holmes promptly interrupted. We merely wish to exclude the impossible, as obvious as it may seem. I was still not reassured. Yes, if that is so, I began, then we can very well rule out other scenarios too. Mr. Marx will not rise on the third day as the proletarian messiah and ascend to heaven, which he does not believe in. It's just as unlikely that he will parade through the streets of London as a resurrected Jamaican voodoo zombie. Holmes would not be provoked. We shall hope so, for his sake and the sake of his daughters, he answered dryly. And yet, someone found it appropriate to abduct his body. We can, however, be sure of the fact that we are searching for more than one perpetrator. One alone could only have done this with considerable difficulties, especially at night. A crime like this needs to be well organized and carried out swiftly and stealthily. A point for Holmes, and so an initial assessment of the circumstances surrounding the theft had been established. It was also evident that the perpetrators had planned the operation with great care, which indicated that these were professional criminals, and it was not some indiscriminate, impulsive act, the likes of a macabre prank. Our coach finally arrived at Seelenfried's funeral parlor, which was located at the south end of Swain's Lane, a road that ascends a steep hill, splitting the cemetery in two parts, an older west and younger east side, connected only via tunnel. The parlor was rather small. Despite of the many funerals held at the neighboring cemetery, business seemed to be struggling. The owner greeted us personally. He had no employees. He introduced himself as Jacob Seelenfried, an elderly Jewish gentleman from Prague. Here in London, his customer base consisted primarily of immigrants of all faiths. It's a catastrophe, he groaned, clasping his hands and looking towards the sky, or the ceiling rather. For once I'm blessed with the good fortune of having a prominent corpse. Customer. I make him look nice so that he is handsome for the funeral, lay him in a velvet-lined coffin, and then he disappears. Just like that. Such a pity. Mr. Seelenfried was visibly shaken. The loss, literally, of a customer, and such a valuable one at that, seemed difficult for him to digest. Mr. Seelenfried, Holmes began, unfortunately, we must ask you some questions about the regrettable loss of your customer, Karl Marx. Yes, if you must, he replied resignedly. It is what it is. Have you ever lost a body before? Holmes asked. The funeral director took offence to the question. What are you implying? Never in 37 years. Everyone knows. At Seelenfried's, you can rest assured you'll be faithfully prepared for eternal peace. Amen. Holmes nodded compassionately and scanned the parlor. There were no security measures against burglary to be seen. All the perpetrators needed to do was break the window beside the door, reach through it, and open the lock from the inside. There were no other doors in the parlor. I see, Holmes remarked. Your parlor is not particularly well secured against unauthorized entry. All you have is a plain deadbolt. Seelenfried was still distressed. Of course. Why would I expect such a thing? What kind of low-grade dimwits break into a funeral parlor to steal a defenseless corpse? How idiotic! I could not contain my smile. Actually, I interjected, we don't necessarily believe that idiots were at play here. The more likely scenario is that we are dealing with a team of professionals who've put much thought into the preparation and execution of this crime. Seelenfried looked perplexed and waved me off. Professionals in what? He asked. In applied stupidity, perhaps. They stole a man's corpse, albeit beautifully dressed by myself, but still just a corpse. I'm ruined. Just imagine if word of this gets out. Seelenfried lost a body. That's not exactly a very good reputation. A catastrophe is what it is. Now, Holmes seemed to struggle to contain a smile. He then quickly tried to console the poor man. Do not worry, he said earnestly. Your client, Mr. Engels, does not want this to get out into the open. That's why he entrusted the investigation to Dr. Watson and me, and not the police. And we assure you that the press will not learn of this. But you must help us. Seelenfried sighed audibly. How can I help you? He asked. Someone broke in. The customer is gone. That's it. Period. Holmes paused and thought. Then he asked the funeral director, "Could you please show us the empty coffin from which Mr. Marx's body was abducted?" Seelenfried agreed with a grumble as he walked to the back of the parlor where various coffins lay atop tables. He waved at us to follow, then froze. "Why did you say empty?" he asked unexpectedly. "Didn't Mr. Engels tell you the coffin wasn't left empty at all?" Holmes furrowed his brow. "How so?" Seelenfried shook his head and said, "Come see for yourself." He walked to one of the coffins, apparently Marx's, opened the lid and looked at us dolefully. "Like I said, idiots." We walked up to the coffin. What we saw was, indeed, perplexing. The coffin was filled to the top with books. Holmes picked up one of the books and read the cover out loud. "Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie" by Karl Marx. He opened the book, turned a page and continued. Second edition, Hamburg, 1872. I also took one of the books into my hands. It was the same German edition of Marx's foundational work. There must have been a total of around 50 identical copies in the coffin. Seelenfried raised his arms in desperation. "What does this mean?" he moaned. "Can you tell me what this is all about?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "I am sorry, I can't," he replied. "Perhaps it's just a prank," I speculated, but was not really convinced. Unsurprisingly, Holmes countered. "This seems a trifle too elaborate to be a prank." Then he turned to Seelenfried. "That would be all. I hope you don't mind if I take one of these books for myself." "Only one?" the funeral director asked indignantly. "Take them all. What should I do with them?" Holmes smiled. "Thank you, but one will do. Please leave the rest in the coffin for the time being." "You bet I will," Seelenfried cried. "I wouldn't dream of tidying up this nonsense. The coffin has already been paid for anyhow." Holmes bid farewell with a simple nod and quickly marched back to the exit, while I placed my copy of Das Kapital back into the coffin. As I was helping Mr. Seelenfried shut the lid, he looked at me as a potential customer. "Dr. Watson," he began, "detective work is surely very dangerous. You must deal with all sorts of heinous and brutal criminals. Have you ever considered getting your affairs in order in case you, God forbid, die in the line of duty? I can make you a good offer. Full service, washing, shaving, combing, embalming, clothing, coffin, funeral with bouquets and wreaths. Best price guaranteed in all North London." Although Seelenfried was not entirely wrong to contemplate these things, I was averse to organizing my premature demise. "Thank you for the offer," I answered politely. "However, I'm not currently planning to depart this life. Perhaps another time. Good day." I made my way to catch up with Holmes. I was almost at the door when I heard the funeral director call, "Think about it. When you're dead, it's too late." The long ride back to Mr. Engels' office on Regent's Park Road was rather monosyllabic. Holmes leafed through the 600-plus paged Das Kapital, at times absent-mindedly and other times frenetically. Every now and then he sounded out a German word. He nodded frequently, shook his head sporadically, and laughed twice. He then snapped the book shut, looked up, and announced, "I understand." I did not even try to hide my surprise. "What do you understand, Holmes?" I asked, dutifully. "Its relevance, my dear Watson," he explained. "It is a most astute analysis. If what he writes is true, then our current economic and social system indeed cannot continue to be justified. No wonder that Marx's opponents wished to bury the book together with the author." I did not quite know what to think, particularly as multiple questions popped up in my head at the same time. For now, I just wanted to ask one. "Holmes, did you really read the whole book during the ride?" "Most of it," Holmes replied. "You're obviously not familiar with the diagonal reading method. I got an overview on Mr. Marx's economic concepts, and there is one thing that seems certain. This capitalism of which he speaks is the most intelligent and organized form of thievery in human history. and all within the framework of the law. Quite remarkable. I had to laugh. For heaven's sake, Holmes, I cried. Have you become a socialist now? Holmes shook his head soberly. There is nothing in this book about socialism. Holmes explained and put it down. And besides, if this overly complex and long-winded tome, which is difficult for the average reader to understand, is meant to be the principal propaganda tool for Marx and Engels, then I am rather pessimistic about this so-called proletarian revolution. No worker will ever understand it. I can comfort you in this regard, I reassured. Socialist literature is as ubiquitous as sand on the beach. It even comes in trivial, understandable formats. Mr. Engels would surely be glad to give you a catchier pamphlet. Holmes shook his head. I, personally, have no use for it. I understood Mr. Marx. His observations are scientifically correct. I just question whether the great philosopher also considered that it is one thing to analyze the world, but a vastly different thing, and that is what matters, to change it. I wanted to bring up Engels again, just as our coach arrived at its destination. Back at the German industrialist and communist's office, Engels introduced us to a guest who had since arrived. The gentleman was a contemporary of Engels with a similar beard and eyes. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, said Engels, may I introduce you to my old friend, Mr. Wilhelm Liebknecht, parliamentarian in the German Reichstag for the Socialist Workers' Party. Liebknecht rose from his chair and shook our hands. His English was quite understandable since he, as we later found out, had spent several years in exile in London, where he met Marx and Engels over 30 years ago. Mr. Liebknecht, Engels explained, travelled here from Leipzig as quickly as he could. He is scheduled to hold a speech at the funeral tomorrow, representing the German working class. Aren't there anti-socialist laws in effect in the German Reich? Are you even legally free to practice your profession? I asked Liebknecht. Quite right, Liebknecht replied. Bismarck's socialist laws prohibit any kind of officially organized political activities. I, however, was voted into Parliament directly. So as long as I don't act in the name of the party, everything is officially legal. You must know, Engels added, Mr. Liebknecht and his comrade, August Bebel, are very successful in Germany, despite the government repression. They are exemplary for the global socialist movement, and yet, Liebknecht continued, arrests, expulsions, raids, and prison sentences are everyday occurrences. We are constantly surveilled. I'm certain that Bismarck has dispatched a couple of secret agents to keep an eye on me here in London. Prussia is everywhere. Holmes, who had been silent, cleared his throat. Gentlemen, he said assertively, time is short. Has Mr. Liebknecht been briefed? Yes, he has, Engels confirmed. We can speak freely. Then I'll get straight to the point. Holmes continued, unfortunately, I must inform you that the whole affair has so far proven difficult. Whichever way you look at it, it makes little sense. Well, one thing seems quite clear, Engels countered. The fact that Marx's body is missing indicates that his scheduled funeral is the target of an act of sabotage. Apparently, Marx's enemies fear him even after death. Certainly, Holmes confirmed. That is a logical conclusion. And if that is the case, all sorts of suspects spring to mind, Liebknecht interjected. There are many who'd be interested in forestalling or obstructing this monumentous event. Anarchist troublemakers, for instance. More likely, however, is the involvement of various state actors. It wouldn't surprise me if secret police from the continent were behind this, be it the Russian Ukraine or the German Geheimpolizei. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he began pacing in circles, sorting his thoughts. Very well, he announced. If their aim was to prevent the funeral from taking place, we will foil their plan, proceed as scheduled, and see what happens. You want to bury an empty coffin? Liebknecht asked, astounded. Holmes smiled. Why no, the coffin isn't empty, he replied. and laid his copy of Das Kapital on the desk. Despite of some trepidation on the parts of Engels and Liebknecht, we decided to go ahead with the plan. Let's face it, we didn't have a better one. The next morning, Holmes went to the cemetery where he met with the mourners, which, as wished, consisted solely of Marx's relatives and close friends. In addition to the 2 German socialists who were familiar with the case, the group consisted of Marx's daughter, Eleanor, and her fiancé, the English socialist Edward Aveling, Marx's sons-in-law, Paul Lafargue and Charles Longuet, both from France, his housekeeper, Helena de Muth, as well as several of his closest and oldest friends. Meanwhile, I was tasked with making sure that the coffin arrives at the cemetery safely. Mr. Seelenfried and I were at his parlor making some final preparations when I got a strange feeling. We never checked to see whether there really were just books inside the coffin, and the fact that it was not left empty could have been a cunning invitation to go ahead with the funeral, just as we had decided to do. Perhaps the perpetrators wished just that, and we fell squarely into their trap. Seelenfried was not very pleased to see me emptying the coffin, book by book. He only began helping after I, having grown slightly annoyed, explicitly asked him to do so. Once we had removed all the books, we discovered an unsettling surprise indeed. 10 sticks of dynamite on the coffin floor. I was upset at myself for our negligence. The dynamite was surely part of some plot. In its unignited state, the dynamite posed no danger to us, as I had to repeatedly assure Seelenfried. To trigger an explosion, one would have to manually ignite the short wicks with a match, for example, and wait for them to burn down. Naturally, this would have been an impossible task underneath all those books, which is why the purpose of this setup did not make sense to me at first. "That's not a very practical death," remarked Seelenfried, "being blasted into pieces by dynamite. What's left to bury? I can tell you, Dr. Watson, even the best funeral directors, and I humbly count myself among them, find these kinds of cases immensely challenging. Once, I only had a left foot to work with." That was the last thing I remembered Seelenfried saying before I was struck on the back of my head with a powerful blow, causing me to drop to the floor and lose consciousness. I regained consciousness in complete darkness and immediately noticed that I was gagged, my arms and legs tied. My head was pounding. I tried sitting up but immediately hit my forehead against something hard. Rolling to the left and to the right, I bumped against walls on both sides. That is when I realized that I was trapped in a coffin. Since I could not see anything, I tried sharpening my other senses. Although the coffin was lined with fabric, I felt something uncomfortable poking into my back. The sticks of dynamite. I was in Karl Marx's coffin, and it was moving. Slowly, my memory returned. After I had been struck, the following must have occurred. The perpetrators, who returned to Seelenfried's parlor, knocked us both out and laid me into the coffin. I wonder what happened to poor Mr. Seelenfried. Disguised as movers or funeral workers, they handed the sealed coffin to the cemetery staff at the main entrance as arranged. They must have prepared some kind of excuse for my obvious absence. Then the funeral procession began, with the coffin being rolled along on a handcart. But then I realized the scope of the plot. It was an assault on the funeral procession. One big bang would wipe out the figurehead of the international socialist movement, Mr. Engels, as well as the highest ranks of German and international social democracy. But how to detonate the dynamite beneath me? The only way would be an initial, smaller explosion that could ignite the sticks of dynamite. This would result in an inferno that hardly any of the mourners, including Holmes, as was occurring to me, could survive. I was merely collateral damage. But where would this explosion take place? My mind was racing. It had to be a spot where the funeral procession would gather and the perpetrators could detonate an explosive unnoticed. There was only one such spot that came to mind. To reach the gravesite at the east side of the cemetery from the main gate, the procession must traverse a tunnel beneath Swain's Lane. I figured there would be an explosion at the end of the tunnel. Timed correctly, this would detonate the dynamite in the coffin. For the mourners, there would be little chances of surviving the blast. At least, I would avoid getting buried alive. My coffin rolled on inexorably over the bumpy cemetery path. I was slowly beginning to feel resigned to my fate when I sensed the oxygen beginning to run out. Seelenfried's quality coffins were even airtight. I gathered my last strength and kicked the lid with my tied feet, the tips of my shoes knocking against the wood. Once, twice, 3 times, I threw myself from side to side, trying desperately to rock the coffin. I knocked my knees against the lid, even my forehead. The cart finally stopped. I could hear voices, then the sound of knocking against the coffin from outside. I took a labored breath and shouted, accompanied by a powerful kick. The voices grew louder and more agitated. I then heard the sound of screws being loosened on the coffin. Finally, after another half a minute, which felt like an eternity to me, the lid was finally opened. I had never been so glad to see Holmes's face in my entire life. He untied me immediately, after which I was able to breathe deeply again. Holmes helped me sit up, and I saw that we were less than 20 yards from the tunnel entrance. It had been high time. Holmes! I panted. A minimum of 2 assailants are hiding at the end of the tunnel. I slumped down in the velvet-lined coffin and lost consciousness once again. I later learned what happened after I had blacked out. Mr. Engels made sure I was brought to a hospital. Holmes, Liebknecht, and Marx's 3 sons-in-law climbed over walls to reach the east side of the cemetery. That is how they avoided the tunnel and were able to surprise the lurking assailants from behind. As it turned out, there were indeed 2 of them. Outnumbered and confronted with Holmes's revolver, the culprits did not resist. When they identified themselves as members of the German secret police, Liebknecht took the opportunity to give them each a pedagogical slap in the face and asked them to send his conspiratory revolutionary regards to the Kaiser and Chancellor in Berlin. There was no doubt that the agents would be able to deliver Liebknecht's greetings. Holmes handed them over to the London police, but as per the international spy trade, they were soon exchanged for 2 British secret policemen who had been detained in Germany and returned unscathed to their homeland. Meanwhile, the body of Karl Marx never left the funeral parlor. The perpetrators had hidden it in an unused coffin, which they stored in the cold basement of the parlor for the time being. What is more, when the secret agents led Holmes and Engels to Marx's body, they discovered that the agents had also lain poor, unconscious Seelenfried inside the same coffin, an experience the good man could have certainly done without. The plan was to bring Marx's body to Germany at a later date. There, his body, and brain in particular, would have been dissected and thoroughly examined in order to gain knowledge on human intelligence and the revolutionary spirit. Naturally, this is total humbug from a medical and scientific perspective, and could have only been conceived of in Germany, but it never came that far anyhow. Instead, the funeral took place with some delay but with dignity, and in the presence of the deceased. I was told that Engels and Liebknecht spoke wonderful eulogies. The public was never informed about the difficult circumstances surrounding the ceremony. I myself only recovered slowly from the events that unfolded at Highgate Cemetery. The memories of these, being trapped in a coffin and imagining my imminent demise, took on a traumatic character. I was long plagued by anxieties, extreme mood swings, and insomnia. Only since I have been receiving psychological treatment from Dr. Kurzman have I been slowly able to process these. In doing so, I now have finally gotten myself to bring this case to paper. A few months after the closure of the case of Karl Marx and the Highgate Cemetery, Friedrich Engels stopped by on Baker Street one morning. He inquired about my well-being and thanked us again for our help. "I truly hope," I said in jest, "you don't lose another friend, dead or alive." "Not to worry, Dr. Watson," Engels replied. "At my age, I've survived most of my friends anyhow. No, I'm only here to personally deliver our newest work, fresh off the press." He pulled a heavy book out of his bag and handed it to Holmes. "It's the 3rd edition of Das Kapital. I've been working on it intensively over the past several weeks," Engels explained, "incorporating several addendums and refinements, all in the interest of Marx. Thank you again, Mr. Holmes, for your notes. They were most valuable for the revision." Holmes nodded humbly. "I am grateful that I could help. But you didn't mention me in the foreword, right?" Engels waved his hand. "No, I didn't," he reassured. "Just as you wished. I was taken by surprise because Holmes did not mention corresponding with Mr. Engels on Das Kapital. By the way," Engels continued, "I am presently in the process of reviewing Marx's estate. He was planning a second, perhaps even 3rd volume of Das Kapital, and left behind a large amount of handwritten material. Even so, I hope to be finished with editing the next volume within 1 year. You would be so kind as to take a look at the manuscript once it is ready?" "It would be my honor," Holmes confirmed. Engels sighed. "Thank you. It's a pity that you and Marx did not have a chance to meet each other. You share some similar characteristics. Your meticulousness, your broad perspective, your astute reasoning, your careful observation skills. Marx would have liked you, and you certainly him. Well now, I must bid you adieu. Madame de Muth does not appreciate me coming late for lunch." I stood up from my chair and reached out my hand to Engels. "Goodbye." Holmes accompanied our guest to the door, whilst I picked up the new edition of Das Kapital. A handwritten dedication on the 3rd page read, "For the brilliant detective Sherlock Holmes and his exceedingly brave companion John Watson, with admiration and friendship, Friedrich Engels." As Holmes returned to the table, I put the book away and gave him a questioning look. "And do you regret not having known Mr. Marx?" Holmes's expression turned serious. "Not at all," he claimed. "According to what I've been told, Mr. Marx seemed very intelligent and yet a notorious know-it-all who loved to correct and outdo his friends, occasionally arrogant, somewhat unworldly and unapproachable." I had to hold back from laughing at Holmes's excellent self-description and just answered, "Indeed, Holmes, you would have certainly not gotten along with such a man. And now my second question. When were you planning on telling me that you've become a theoretician of scientific socialism?" Holmes shook his head, took a seat, and began packing his pipe. "By no means," he explained. "I just made a few comments. I can assure you, my good Watson, that I remain a decided proponent of capitalism." "I thought you regarded capitalism as organized thievery." I reminded Holmes of his own words. "Quite right," Holmes confirmed. "I remain so for that very reason. Imagine a socialist utopia, as envisioned by the gentlemen Marx and Engels. No social distinctions, no significant private ownership, no poverty, no wealth, prosperity for all, no envy, no existential fears, no exploitation, no suppression, no banks, no landowners, no aristocracy. Ultimately, not even money in the true sense. All this would result in a massive reduction in crime. My dear Watson, I assure you, in such a world we detectives would be out of work. May we be spared the proletarian revolution in our lifetime." He then broke out in his distinctive impish smile and contentedly lit his pipe.